Good morning. Good morning. There we go. Let's make sure. I get this. So last week we had an intro to the Gospel of Matthew where we emphasized what's unique to Matthew and also how we can know that it really was written by Matthew. That's not just some tradition without evidence. There's plenty of evidence that we went over. And today I want to do a similar intro to the Gospel of Mark. And as Larry announced today, next week we will have a presentation on the Appalachian Service Project from the people who went. And it's a pretty inspiring work there. So if you follow on Facebook, you've seen some more photos. I think they've been finishing it after they finished it up. Yeah, they finished it up, and that's quite a blessing to that family with the disabled children. So today we want to look at Mark, and after the presentation we'll go back and we'll have a week on Luke and a week on John also, and then Larry can take over some in August. Who wrote Mark? Well, as we mentioned last week, the Gospels don't have at the beginning the name of an author. Unlike, say, Paul's epistles, where he starts right out writing a letter and he says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the Christians at some place, so you know it's from Paul. But that's not the case with the Gospels, because the Gospels were written so that the author's name was probably on the outside of a scroll, and that's how you found it, but that wasn't considered part of the body of the Gospel to be copied. However, knowledge in the Christian community was carried forward through generations, and then we have plenty of external evidence, that is, the writings of Christians, that this was from Mark, and then internal evidence, just like we looked at last week. There was external evidence for Matthew being written by Matthew. And then there was internal evidence that this was written by a tax collector, for example, because of the knowledge. The internal and external evidence agreed. We're going to see something similar for Mark. What's the external evidence about the authorship? Well, we go into the 2nd century when we have writings from early Christians. One of the earliest, Papias, when he was a young man and the Apostle John was a very old man, Papias actually studied with John. He was discipled by John, and he records many of the things that John taught him back when, in about 90 AD, when he was a minor. He refers to John as John the Elder, which is how you see John referring to himself in 2nd and 3rd John. And so he wrote, the elder said this. He taught Papias when Papias was a boy. Mark became an interpreter of Peter. As many things as he remembered, he wrote down accurately, though certainly not in order. And we've seen this before, that Gospels can arrange things topically. They're not all chronological, and this was well known in the early Christian community. And we need to not make the mistake when we're reading of thinking everything is chronological, because a lot of it is topical. You can see that. We all see it. The things said or done by the Lord, for he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but he came later. Mark is not an apostle. Mark was not there during the Galilean ministry of Jesus Christ. He got his information from Peter, who was there. So whenever the need arose and Peter taught, that's when Mark recorded. What else? All the other 2nd century fathers agree. Those who wrote explicitly include Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus. And they said specifically that Peter was preaching in Rome and Mark was recording what Peter taught. And so, if you think about it, you might say that Mark did not sit down and say, I'm going to write a gospel. That's what Matthew did. Rather, Peter said, I'm going to preach the gospel. And Mark said, I'm going to write this down. And so we have the gospel. It is a gospel. But it wasn't necessarily written with the same motivation. This is a record of how Peter preached the gospel. And it's particularly valuable to us because today we often need to explain the gospel to people who don't necessarily have a lot of Bible background anymore. Who was Peter preaching to in Rome? Just Gentile, pagan Romans. They weren't studied in what we call Old Testament. They weren't knowledgeable in the Bible. They weren't waiting for a Messiah. Matthew wrote to Jews to convince them Jesus is the Messiah you've been waiting for. Matthew talks about all kinds of Old Testament prophecies and other Old Testament references because he's writing to Jews who know this stuff. Matthew has a genealogy of Jesus and a birth story of Jesus, proving that Jesus miraculously comes from the lineage of David, because the Messiah has to be descended from David. Romans don't know anything about that. They're not waiting for a Messiah. They don't know anything about David. And so this is how Peter preaches to them, and it's kind of a model for us. How do you start talking about the gospel with people who have no particular expectation or Bible knowledge? This is becoming more and more useful today because we can't assume today that people have any great Bible knowledge. About 150 to 160 AD, Justin Martyr wrote, he called the Gospel of Mark the Memoirs of Peter. In other words, Peter's the one who's really behind this gospel, not Mark. You can almost think of this as a Gospel of Peter if it weren't for the fact that there's an apocryphal second century gospel that somebody called the Gospel of Peter to try to give it legitimacy. That's not the Gospel of Peter we're talking about. The second gospel is really Peter preaching the gospel. And so Justin Martyr didn't even refer to it as the Gospel of Mark so much as he called it the remembrances or memoirs of Peter. But once again, what about internal evidence? Is there evidence inside the Bible that would support all of this early Christian tradition, or is it just some unreliable tradition? Well, first of all, is there anything about the Gospel of Mark that locates it in Rome, like the early Christian tradition does? What's Roman about it? Well, first of all, one of the things that has always jumped out to people in the Gospel of Mark is that Aramaic words are used, but then they're immediately translated into Greek and explained. Now think about that. If you were speaking to a Jewish audience who spoke Aramaic as their first language and Greek was their second language, their trade language, then it wouldn't really make sense for you to give them an Aramaic word and stop and translate it into Greek and explain it in Greek. It's the opposite. So this is a sign that the people being preached to by Peter are Gentiles, and they need translations of Aramaic. So some examples. And to James, the son of Zebedee, and to his brother John, he gave the name Boanerges. That's an Aramaic word. And then immediately there's a translation. That is sons of thunder. There are numerous examples. When he raised a little girl from the dead, when Jesus raised a little girl from the dead, you can kind of picture that certain Aramaic words stuck in Peter's memory, so that even when he was preaching to Gentiles, he would repeat those Aramaic words and then stop and explain them. Because Peter was there and certain Aramaic words were meaningful, dramatic. When he raised the little girl from the dead, he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. So this is another example of Aramaic that appears and is immediately translated. I'm not going to show them all because there are 18 examples in the Gospel of Mark of Aramaic, and in all 18 cases they are immediately translated and explained. And this is not typical of the other Gospels at all. So there's something unique to Mark here. That would agree with it being preaching in Rome, but let's go on. There's more evidence about Rome. Twice he even uses Latin words borrowed into the Greek. That's another sign that you're in Rome. It's not always visible in English. For example, outside the temple Jesus was observing, a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins into the treasury box, which make a penny. Well, penny is what they translate it to in English. It's actually a Latin word, quadrans, that's only used in this story, once in Mark and once elsewhere. But it's interesting that it's a Roman word, it's a Latin word. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium. Now that Latin word is actually right there in the King James Version and the New King James Version. But in all the other translations, it comes out something like palace or governor's palace or governor's house or something like that. But in the original, it's in Latin, Praetorium. Another thing that's interesting is that in Mark, we see him pausing to explain Jewish customs. And I think this was Peter explaining to his audience and Mark recording it. Because I think Peter would have needed to explain to a Roman audience Jewish customs. But if you're preaching to Jews, obviously you wouldn't do this. It wouldn't make any sense to stand there and tell Jews. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. And it goes on to say they wash cups and bowls, and they even wash the couches they sit on, and so on and so forth. You don't explain all that to Jews. I mean, that would be kind of strange. They know that. It doesn't need to be explained to them. It's their custom. You explain their custom to someone else. You explain that to Gentiles. So this is, once again, apparently a gospel of preaching to the Gentiles. When evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. I don't think Jews need to have it explained to them what the terminology is of Passover week. For Jews, you could just say it was the preparation day. For a Roman audience, though, what does the phrase preparation day mean? It's, would they know what you're talking about? I mean, so Peter explains whenever he makes reference to some Jewish custom. Interestingly enough, you can also get evidence of who this was preached to by looking at what's not there, the omissions. We mentioned that Matthew had a genealogy of Jesus and a birth story accompanying it. So does Luke. This is important to Jews, right? To convince Jews this is the Messiah. He's descended from David. But you picture that you're Peter preaching in Rome. what would a genealogy do for them? That doesn't help a Roman Gentile audience. They have no messianic expectations or anything of the kind. And therefore, there's very little reference to Old Testament messianic prophecy. There's only one place in the whole Gospel of Mark where an Old Testament prophecy is quoted by the author, by Peter or Mark. And that's at the very beginning when it says that it was prophesied that there would be one who would come before Jesus, John the Baptist. Chapter 1, very beginning. After that point, the only Old Testament quotations in the entire Gospel of Mark come out of the mouth of Jesus. They're recorded by Peter because Peter was interacting with Jewish leaders and with Jewish audiences, and Jesus quoted the Old Testament. And so they're recorded in the Gospel of Mark. But in Matthew, there's all kinds of editorial comment from Matthew that's not out of the words of Jesus, in which Matthew explains this fulfills what the prophet said about something or other, because Matthew was writing for Jews. But when you're writing for Gentiles, they have no knowledge of messianic prophecy. You're not quoting that to them. There's no Sermon on the Mount. I think one of the things we often miss about the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount is full of, you have heard it was said, but I say to you. The Sermon on the Mount is a huge correction of what the Jews had been taught by their teachers. Starting even from the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes, which emphasize humility and terminate with talking about even loving those who persecute you. The Sermon on the Mount, which talks about turning the other cheek, going the extra mile with the one who forces, giving him your cloak. This is all contrary to what the Jews were hearing about how to interact with the Roman occupiers, for example. And so the Sermon on the Mount is very much a correction by Jesus early in his ministry of what his audience had been taught. And in some cases, he quotes from the Old Testament. But in some cases, it's kind of interesting, like he says, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, you shall love your neighbor is in the Old Testament. Where's the hate your enemy part? You shall love your neighbor is the golden rule expressed in Leviticus 19, verse 18. It doesn't go on to say, you shall hate your enemy. Where did they get that teaching? Well, the Jewish teachers and leaders were trying to justify hatred of non-Jews, particularly the Romans, right? And so often Jesus, throughout the Sermon on the Mount, says, you have heard this, but I say to you, love your enemy. There's none of that in the Gospel of Mark. And skeptical scholars would say, well, gosh, why would the Sermon on the Mount, this incredibly beautiful teaching, not be in the Gospel of Mark? Does that mean that, Matthew just made it up or something? It's not in the Gospel of Mark because we don't always catch how Jewish it is. It was a correction of Jewish teaching. And that's not really on Peter's mind as he tries to reach a Roman audience when he's preaching the gospel. Now, this is all good so far, but to really support the Christian tradition that Peter preached the gospel in Rome to Gentiles, and Mark recorded it. We really need some evidence that Mark and Peter were in Rome working together. We need to place them in Rome at the same time in order for it to be believable. How do we do that? Well, we have some references to Mark in the book of Acts and in Paul's epistles. The first thing we find is that when Peter got sprung out of jail, so to speak, by an angel, he was released from his chains. He was led outside and he realized, this isn't a dream. This is real. I'm free. Where did he go? It says he went to the house of the mother of John Mark. Now apparently you can trace through Acts that John Mark starts being called Mark at a certain point. Probably to avoid confusion with all the Johns that there were at that time. So John Mark's mother's house was a gathering place for the Christians, including the apostles, in Jerusalem. You'll recall Peter went to the gate of the house. It's apparently a pretty affluent place. It's a pretty big house. It's got an outer gate. And Peter shows up and knocks on the gate, and the servant girl, Rhoda, comes out, and Peter speaks, and she's so excited she doesn't even let him in. She turns around and runs in and says, Peter's at the gate, and everybody's, oh, you're seeing things, you know. But actually it was Peter. Mark would have met Peter at this house during all these gatherings. Next chapter. First missionary journey, John Mark accompanies Paul and Barnabas. But then halfway through the first missionary journey, he leaves and returns to Jerusalem. And then in Acts 15, we read that when the second missionary journey of Paul is about to begin, Barnabas says, okay, let's take Mark with us. And Paul says, I'm not going to take the one who left us in the middle of the first journey. So there's been a falling out between Paul and Mark at this point in time, hasn't there? And so what happens is Barnabas takes Mark with him, and they go off on their own missionary journey. And Paul takes Silas on the second missionary journey. And so it's Paul and Silas who are in jail, and the Philippian jailer is converted after the earthquake and so on in Acts 16. Paul and Silas are there, Barnabas and Mark are not there. At this point in time, Mark and Paul have had a falling out. But if we continue to read the references, we get down to the end of Paul's life when he has been imprisoned in Rome for the second time. He's writing what are known as the prison epistles of Paul. And now he starts making reference in those prison epistles. When he gets to the point of the closing remarks, the salutations at the end of epistles, he starts making positive references to Mark. And that's how we know that the falling out had come to an end, that they were back in each other's, or maybe it's a one-way street. Mark is back in the good graces of Paul, according to the references. At the end of Philemon, Paul says, the final couple of verses, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my co-workers. So Luke and Mark are among the co-workers of Paul when he is in prison for the final time in Rome. And at the same time that Philemon was written, Paul writes Colossians. In fact, Philemon, according to Colossians, Philemon is hosting the church in Colossia is basically a house church. It's being hosted in Philemon's home. And at the end of Colossians, once again, we see this positive reference to Mark. And we're going to see it again, and we're going to put it on the screen in just a moment because it relates to something else too. But what about Peter? Well, there is a connection between Peter in Rome and Mark, because Peter says, she who is in Babylon. Now that was a code for Rome used by the early Christians because they considered Rome to be a city of great evil because of the persecutions. And Babylon from the Old Testament was a symbol of a city of great evil. But if you wrote openly that Rome was an evil city, then you might get caught. You might be in trouble for that. And so calling it Babylon was a way of communicating your disgust with Rome in a way that might not get you in trouble. But Peter says, she who is in Babylon, she is probably the personification of the congregation in Rome. The entire congregation in Rome. Elect together with you greet you, and so does Mark, my son. So he's referring to Mark as his spiritual son. So we see Peter in Rome working with Mark, good relationship with Mark. So this internal evidence is in total agreement with the external evidence. And just as we noted last week with Matthew, there are no competing theories, really. In the second century, when Christians talk about the Gospels, there is no, well, maybe the first Gospel was written by Matthew, and then there are another group of Christians say, well, maybe it was written by somebody else. There is no such thing. There is no disagreement. There is no alternate theory. The same thing's true of Mark. There's only one bit of external evidence, which early Christians said Mark wrote this gospel based on Peter's preaching. And the internal evidence all agrees with it. So then our next question is, to get an intro understanding of Mark, who is Mark? What do we know about this person, Mark? Well, let's put the Colossians 4:10 up here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So Mark is the cousin of Barnabas, which sheds a little bit of light on Barnabas sticking up for Mark. Not only is Barnabas an encouraging kind of person, he was sticking up for his cousin. We know it wasn't just that, because Barnabas' real name was Joseph. At the end of Acts chapter 4, he was given the new name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, apparently because he was so encouraging to the other believers. And so, yeah, there is some of that. Barnabas sticks up for Mark. Let's take him back. Let's take him on the second journey, because Barnabas is an encouraging kind of person. But there's also an element of, hey, this is my cousin. I'm vouching for him. Let's take him. That's right. There could be consequences to somebody leaving. There could be a weakening of the mission if somebody leaves. Right, the prophecy of the destruction, which is actually found in several Gospels. We know that this was an affluent family. according to the end of Acts chapter 4, one of the Christians who sold property so that they could support all these pilgrims who were staying in Jerusalem now that they'd been baptized and not going back home was Barnabas. Barnabas was Joseph. He was from Cyprus, the island in the Mediterranean. No doubt he has property there, and yet he has extra property near Jerusalem to sell. And Mark's mother has this large house where all the Christians can gather. You add it all up, this is a pretty affluent family. That probably means they're well educated. They could afford more education. And so that's kind of interesting because Peter is an example of someone being used by God to do great things without being all that educated. He's just a fisherman, and yet he has a zeal for the Lord. And he has the ability to speak and to preach the gospel. And God is able to use him, whether he's educated or not. But it's also useful, God can make use of an educated man to do the writing. At the end of 1 Peter, Peter acknowledges Silas, by his Latin name Silvanus, as being the one who actually wrote down 1 Peter. Peter spoke to him. Silas was the one doing the writing. And 2 Peter shows signs that it was someone besides Peter, someone kind of writing very flowery language in the Greek. So it's interesting that Peter was used as the leader of the early church by God, and he's behind 3 books in the New Testament. The Gospel of Mark, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, but it doesn't look like he actually wrote down any of the 3. Others were used by God to do the writing. And so whatever your background, there's a place. It's like the picture that Paul gives of the body. All the different parts of the body are necessary. Not every part has the same function in the body. There's a place for the educated Silas and Mark. And there's a place for Galilean fishermen like James and John and Peter and Andrew, who might not have so much education. What's the style of the gospel? Well, the style of the gospel gives us some insight into the preaching of the gospel, since this is Peter's preaching. How did Peter preach the gospel? How did he get the attention of these Gentiles in Rome who don't have Bible knowledge and don't have any expectation of a Messiah? How do you get them? Well, he seems to alternate several miracle stories in a row. And once you get the attention of the audience with these miracles, then he's got teachings of Jesus. And then we go back to several miracles. And then that's followed by some more teachings. And recall that the early Christians knew that this wasn't all arranged chronologically. Because a preacher doesn't have to preach a chronological version. A preacher can preach topically to make the point to his audience. So Peter's approach was miracles. That validates the teachings that come next. And then some more miracles. And we can see that throughout the first 10 chapters, that's the style. Then comes the final journey to Jerusalem and the crucifixion, the resurrection, and so on. 6 out of the 16 chapters are the final month of Jesus' life. There's a huge emphasis in Mark on the end of Jesus' life. And just this little graph to show alternating miracles and teaching. The blue bars are how many verses of narrative and teaching you have with no miracles, The red bars are how many verses do you have that are nothing but miracle stories, one after another. So the first 20 verses of the book are the opening narrative. Then you have 37 verses in a row of one miracle after another. Then you go to some teachings, then miracles, then a huge bunch of teachings and a huge bunch of miracles and so on. And this is the first 8.5 chapters of Mark represented here. There's a perfect alternation of pretty lengthy miracle section and pretty lengthy teaching section and lengthy miracle and lengthy teaching. This is how Peter taught the gospel to Roman Gentiles. So maybe that's effective when reaching people. Maybe we have to emphasize the miracles as validation of the teachings of Jesus today. So, are there any questions about Mark? Thank you for your time. And next week we will start out with the Appalachian Service Project Report.
Real quick before you leave, I just wanted to mention again about the baby shower next weekend. It is for everyone. Taylor is flying in, hopefully getting in on Friday. But he wants to be a part of the baby shower. So it is for men as well as women. It will not be your typical baby shower. And there will be food. So please come and celebrate them. Melissa's having...
Oh, they already said it's a girl.